I'm happy to be here speaking on the Netherlands integration model. As a civil servant, I'm a bit of a minority here today, at least among the speakers. And it does not happen frequently that civil servants are asked to criticize their government's policies. Although I'd be delighted to do so, of course. No, it does come with some difficulty. Our job description does not quite fit well with taking up that role. We're usually at the receiving end of criticism. We get criticism of, well, media, migrants, opposition, academics, NGOs, well, and our citizens, of course. So I know enough so as to incorporate some criticism that others have made regarding our policies throughout my presentation. Let me see. Before embarking or going further with my presentation, I'd like to reflect a little on how you can be critical and at which levels. I think we've just seen an excellent presentation which could very well refer to the Dutch situation, actually. I think German and Dutch models are often very comparable, but that was focusing on the outcomes of policy. Do the policies that we invent or that we come up with actually deliver results? Different level would be to look at the policies. Do we do the right things, or are we forgetting things? And one final level would be looking at the debate. Are we discussing the right things? So that's a bit the levels I will look into during my presentation. But I want to be even more critical, and I'd like to start with criticizing the title of the presentation, because I have to discuss the Dutch integration model, and I wonder whether we really have such a thing, or it's good to keep in mind the limits of this model. First, being a civil servant, working for a ministry, I always think our policies are very decisive, and we do set, of course, certain legislation, but at least in the Netherlands, local communities and cities have much autonomy, and they'll have the freedom to make up and establish their own integration policies, and you see that there's different approaches being taken. Actually, when you look at integration policies in many cities, integration as a word is not used frequently anymore. It's participation policies they do. So, and one other thing, the current Dutch integration model seems to imply that with every new government we have a different model, but thank God models outlive governments, and usually they do some changes, and some changes are made, but there's many constants and there's variables, I would say. So that's what I'll be looking at. But first, an historic and geographic overview of migration in the Netherlands, because you cannot have such a thing as integration policy without a migration policy. The other way around, you could have, and we've done, and we've learned from that. I'll get onto that in a minute. In the Netherlands, we have around almost 20% of immigrants with, immigrants or people of immigrant origin. You see here a division or distinction being made between non-Western and Western, and that is a distinction that's based on OECD distinctions, or rather on income of countries. It's not Western versus Eastern, it's a bit of a North-South divide. Our largest immigrant groups are Turkish and Moroccan, which were labor migrants that came to the Netherlands around the 1970s, and people from our former colonies. So 20% is not that much, or what do you think, what's much and what's little? but it's not evenly spread. We've got 12 provinces. Most of those 20% are based in the western part of the Netherlands, and in 4 provinces. And in these provinces, immigrants are not evenly distributed either. Here's the provinces. I went a bit too quick. There's some effects I didn't know of. Actually, within those provinces, people tend to settle in the larger cities. So the situation currently, or as of January 2011, was that in cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, 35% of the population is of immigrant background. Projections are that in 2020, it could even be a majority. So that's whole different pictures. Within those cities, you see, it's not evenly spread either. There's ethnic concentration. Migrants that arrived in the Netherlands often have lower education, socioeconomic position. So they tend to concentrate where low-priced housing stock is to be found, and that tends to be concentrated in the Netherlands. So the picture of where minorities settle is almost identical to where you find low-priced housing stock. And I actually live in such a community in Amsterdam, and it's 80% of people with immigrant backgrounds and 20% of indigenous Dutch. So it's a whole different neighborhood, you could say, and it has changed that dramatically over, I think, 20, 30 years. So for people who've been living there, that's been pretty dramatic. Many Dutch people have moved away from these neighborhoods as well, even reinforcing the fact that there's very concentrated neighborhoods. The changes are difficult for people to accept and to live with, and they have not always been changes for the better. You see shops, industry left, people with little job prospects tend to be concentrated. Schools tend to be become black or not really mixed. In the Netherlands, we have invested very much effort in building strong communities. There's about 50 communities like this in the Netherlands, we really much acknowledge the spatial aspects of integration, and I think focusing on such spatial aspects is important in your integration policy. Now, moving on to the debate in the Netherlands, I've made a very rough distinction, and you could very much criticize it, I think. So I just did it in the afternoon, so to say. Probably if you do some more sound analysis, you reach at different conclusions, but this just served me well in my story. When we saw the first immigrants, we thought they would be temporary, and they would, after having worked in the Netherlands for several years, would go back to their country of origin. So we had a migration policy without an integration policy, I would say. That's been criticized heavily. I think everybody in the Netherlands agreed that that was one of the big mistakes we made, assuming that people were not here to stay. What aggravated the situation was that many mainly Turkish and Moroccan guest workers did have not much education and worked in certain industries, and with economic development, those industries went bankrupt or just, and they could not find a different job. They did not speak the language. So you see, we created a lot of welfare dependency and unemployment among those groups. not contributing to public support for immigration. Then we moved on to the multicultural model. I think I was just thinking about the words of the French ambassador, and he said, well, we need to be calm and not to be emotional. I think in the Netherlands we've seen a very heated debate in this period of time, and it did not remain calm. I'm mixing up things, sorry. Multicultural model was very much focused, the first integration policies that we had in the Netherlands were very much focused on socio-economic position of groups, and we did not really have a debate. And there were taboos on discussing certain problems that we found, and political correctness was the dominant view. And then we had the period in which we experienced this heated debate. That was like around 2000. There were voices came up that articulated some popular concerns about the socio-economic position of migrants, the high unemployment, high welfare dependency, but also more cultural aspects that were not really discussed previously. The unequal position of women, honor-related crimes, radical thinking among certain groups. So what this was aggravated by the events of 9/11, an assassination of a Dutch filmmaker. So it was really, I think, a heated time in the Netherlands. What happened is that there was a shift in our policy towards more socio-cultural aspects as well, and very much a focus on problems and failures. I think collectively the integration policy in the Netherlands was declared failed, and there was a shift towards requiring more from migrants as well. Previously it was very much the state who offered all kinds of services, and a bit of a one-way street, and now expectations of migrants were also put at the forefront. So where are we now? That's a big question. To a certain extent, we're still beyond the multicultural model, but I think there's been some reflection as well on how to move further and what were the effects of this heated debate. We essentially want people who are there in the Netherlands and want them to feel welcome as well and want them to do well. And talking only about problems and failures is to a certain extent a self-fulfilling prophecy, but also puts away people in certain groups. We have many people who succeeded in the Netherlands, are doing very well. Our previous Minister for Immigration and Integration was a woman of Turkish background. We've got very many talented people with Moroccan or Turkish backgrounds at our universities. And because of the talks and the way the debate is going on in the Netherlands, they still feel that they're not accepted completely and they're not doing well enough. So now we've seen a more of a focus on citizenship again, trying more to find what unites us and moving away from specific policies to mainstreaming of services. So no focus on specific the crime rates among Moroccan youth and developing action plans to deal with that, but looking at our general policies and making them efficient and equally accessible for immigrants. We also, in our current models, there's much of focus on self-reliance, a bit of the US model, I would almost say. Just zooming in on some constants in her policy, that's ensuring equal rights and opportunities, access and chances, and language being a key aspect of that. That's been a constant over 30 years. Actually, we've had many debates on integration tests and new tests for naturalization, but ensuring equal rights and opportunities remains at the backbone of our integration policy and has remained for like that for a long time, as well as addressing deprivation in terms of education, labor market position, income, care and housing. I think the German presentation earlier this afternoon gave some examples of policies that I recognize and we equally carry out in the Netherlands. Discrimination, very important. I mean, that's a pillar stone and backbone of our integration policy. If you cannot offer people equal chances or they're continuously exposed to discrimination, it's going to be difficult for people to make it. So, some variables. Language and introduction courses and requirements. Well, Mr. Little already provided some criticism with regard to those. In the Netherlands, we have experimented in a great deal. We've invested enormous amounts of money in language programs and training, and over the last 4 years, it amounted to 500 million euros on an annual basis. So we also developed courses, portfolios involving host society, trying to tie those courses to work and actual participation. But a shift has now been made. We've got a new legislative proposal in Parliament, which is quite radical in that now migrants are expected to pay or prepare for themselves. They need to carry out a test, but they can choose to follow a course or not. That's up to themselves. And they'll have to pay for that themselves as well. There will be a financial loan system so people who are not able to pay it can take up a loan. But that's pretty much the new approach. And I think it's, I overheard a presentation of somebody from the US last week, and I think we are sort of on close with the US in that respect. Attention for problems with specific groups in integration versus mainstreaming. I just explained a little about that. I think in Netherlands integration policy we've focused very much on groups. And it has caused some resentment also among Dutch native population, in that migrants are continuously seen as being favored, getting specific attention. And so we are now moving to a more inclusive approach, trying to make policies for all, focusing on disadvantages rather than disadvantages of certain groups. Now, we in the Netherlands are confronted with different immigration patterns. We again have more temporary labor migration, actually free movements, because the largest immigrant groups in the Netherlands, our largest inflow of immigrants is from Poland and other Eastern European countries. So that raises, again, questions of how to deal with that. I mean, we've seen in past experience that neglecting it and thinking, yeah, all people will, yeah, they will work here and then they'll go home. That's not quite true. People fall in love. People like it in the Netherlands as well, which is very good. We're very happy with. And so there will be people staying as well, and it's also good to look at how to assist people and how to ensure that our services are equally providing for them. Super diversity, it's again, we have to rethink our integration policy in view of the fact that nowadays young people in Amsterdam, they don't, when having a Moroccan background, they don't always feel so much Moroccan anymore. They don't have the same identification with, for instance, their grandparents. Sometimes they identify more with Egyptians in Amsterdam. So you see different patterns of identity emerging, and that also poses some interesting thoughts for how to move on in our policies. So I'll conclude with that. Yeah.